Okay, good morning, everyone. I see everyone's kind of popping in and showing up here. So Cindy's here. Good morning, Cindy. Good morning, Tika again. Good morning, Lily. Good morning, Casey and Ying. Good morning. Manish is here. Good morning. Ella's here. You're a little bit late. That's okay, Ella. We just started. Aliana's here. Good morning to you. Karen's here. Good morning, Karen. Who else is here? Sam's here. Good morning, Sam. Mashid is here. Hello, Mashid. Who else? I think that's most of who we have so far. So we're gonna do. Good morning, Adelbert. We'll do a couple things today. We will. Good morning, Carmen. We'll look a little bit more at Sumerian civilization. I got you to do some reading, so we'll talk about that, and then we'll move on and we'll talk about the power of story, I guess is what we'll say. Before we get going, I wanted to ask you a question, and maybe you can answer me in the live chat here. But the question I wanted to ask you is, based on what you've read so far, what kind of similarities do you see between the Sumerian civilization and between our own? Because I think it's pretty interesting that we're looking 5 or 6,000 years in the past, but already we're seeing a lot of things that are familiar to us, right? Even though the Sumerians had probably a very different culture, certainly a different language, different religion, different way of life, I think we're seeing a lot of things that are not unfamiliar to us. And so what do you see? What do you see that is similar between their civilization, their lives, and our own? Karen says there's a centralized system of government. Yeah, that's true, right? We're used to having someone in charge, right? Whether it's a king, or whether it's kind of a dictator, or whether it's a president, or whether it's a president who wants to be a dictator, but we won't go into that. Or whether it's a democratic government with a legislature and a prime minister, whatever it is, we are very used to having some form of central government that controls our society, right? So that's a great one, right? But the Sumerians had a centralized form of government, and so do we. What else do you see? Other similarities between the Sumerians and ourselves. Cindy says they believe in multiple gods and goddesses. Yeah, so they have a polytheistic religion, right? And we still have religions in the world today that are like that, right? Hinduism is a perfect example of a religious system with lots of gods and goddesses, right? And you could even be, Cindy, you could even be more general and just say they have a religion, right? And really all cultures, all societies around the world have some kind of religion or spiritual practice, right? So that's something that's very similar between the Sumerians and ourselves. They have some kind of religion or spiritual practice. What else? What other similarities, broad similarities, do you see between the Sumerians and between our own cultures and civilizations? Let's see. Eliana says, marriage as a contract. Yeah, and even just marriage in general. If you look at other cultures around the world, you'll see that basically all cultures have some form of marriage. The marriages look different in terms of who's in them. Sometimes there's 2 people, or sometimes there's 3 or 4 or 5 people in them. Sometimes the couple, or sometimes marriage partners live together, sometimes they don't. But marriages exist in all cultures, and so interestingly, the Sumerians had marriage just like we do. Thika says, yeah, they have written words to record important information. Absolutely. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but the Sumerians probably have, if not the first written, the first system of writing ever invented. If they don't have the first one, they have definitely one of the first ones. So that's a similarity. Casey says, yeah, they have local rulers. And so we have that as well, right? We have a centralized form of government, but also we have people who are in charge of the local area, whether they're the mayor of our city or here in Canada, we have premiers of our provinces. So yeah, we have a centralized system of government, but we also have local governors, local rulers who are in charge. What else do they have? Well, they have buildings, right? They've created what we call monumental architecture, so large stone buildings for worship, for religion, but also to live in. Whether you're a king or whether you're a merchant or something, they were creating buildings to live in. That's something that we have. What else? Come on, there's more than that, you guys. There's more than that. Let's see. Well, the Sumerians make their living by farming, right? So that's how we get our food today. It's farmed, not by us personally, maybe, but by someone. So we get, hey Jimmy. So we get our food through agriculture, just like the Sumerians did. What else do we have here? The Sumerians pay taxes, right? We all pay taxes, unfortunately. I'm sure we're all very happy about that. Good morning, Luan. Sumerians pay taxes. The Sumerians have laws, right? Hey Michael. We read a little bit about Sumerian laws, right? And so Sumerians have laws. So just even on the very surface, Casey says, yeah, social hierarchies. Yeah, not everyone in Sumerian society is equal. Some people have more power and money and opportunity, and some have less, right? And probably all of our societies are like that, right? Some people have more power and opportunity than others do. So that's very familiar to us as well. So it's kind of interesting to think about a society, a culture that lived thousands of years ago. And in many ways, their culture and their way of life was totally different than ours. But in lots of ways, it was very similar, right? They were living in cities in some cases. They were trading for what they needed. They were growing their own food. They had laws and religion and writing. And so these people in many ways are different from us, but in many ways are also not so much. So let's dive in there, okay? I forgot to talk about this yesterday. If it's not in my slides, sometimes I forget. I did mark your homework, the homework that I gave you about a week or so ago, where you had to talk about something meaningful and explain what it culturally meaningful, and kind of explain what it was. Try to figure out what kind of cultural values or meanings was in that object or that thing or that place, and then talk a little bit about what it meant to you in your life. And so how I kind of graded this, first of all, I looked and did you do what I asked you to do? And I think most of you did. I looked at whether you were able to describe that object or that place, which is part of what I asked you to do. I was looking for whether you could explain what this thing meant, either kind of symbolically or in terms of values and beliefs. And did you kind of connect this thing to your life in a meaningful way? And so what I was looking to see is that did you understand how cultural objects or places, how they can carry meaning, how they can transmit meaning to people? And were you able to kind of think about that and explain it and connect it to your own life? And so kind of what I was looking for here is your ability to kind of think about this stuff. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to develop our thinking. And so that's kind of what I was looking for. Did you understand what we talked about, and were you able to think about it and understand it in the context of your own cultural life, and were you able to connect it to your personal life? Okay, so I put the grades on Student Portal for that, but I did do it. I just wanted to talk about that really quickly. Okay, so yesterday we talked about what civilizations were, and we said civilizations were sort of situations in which citizens brought themselves together and they organized themselves politically and socially and economically and religiously, right? So it's a bunch of people living together and agreeing to live together in a certain way, right? And we said that sometimes we use the word civilized to it has a positive association with it, right? To be civilized is good and to be uncivilized is bad. And so we use the word that way sometimes, but here in this class and in anthropology, we want to make sure that we don't sort of judge some cultures as better than others. Certainly some are more complex in certain terms of how they work and what technology they have. But that doesn't mean one is sort of more advanced or more, it doesn't mean that one is better than another, okay? And so we always want to make sure that we can distinguish between people and technology and social complexity. So we can be looking at a culture or a civilization that has complicated technology, that has a complicated social or political or economic organization, but it doesn't say anything about the people. Okay, so people are equally advanced, but sometimes societies that they live in, some are more complicated than others. Okay, so we just want to make sure that we don't make an ethnocentric judgment on cultures based on the way that they live their lives. Okay. So we said really quickly that civilizations had specialization of labor. Okay, so they had people who had different jobs. So not everyone was a farmer, not everyone was a hunter or a gatherer. People had different jobs in society. And again, that's true for the Sumerians here, and it's also true for us, right? We have people doing different jobs in society. We have economic and political centralization. So I think we read a little bit today that the Sumerians, their economy was organized by the king and by the temple priests, right? And so there was political centralization there as well. Humans and other organisms are domesticated. And so to be domesticated is kind of to be tamed in some way. And so people growing their own crops and raising their own animals, they've domesticated those things. Civilizations have monumental architecture, so usually giant stone buildings and things like that. They have taxation, unfortunately. They have culturally ingrained ideas of progress and supremacism, so civilizations often feel that they are better than than groups of people who do not live in civilizations. And they're usually expansionist. They want to take over more territory and gain more resources. Okay, so we started talking about Mesopotamia yesterday, and I'm just going to jump one more here. And we said that Mesopotamia was not a culture. Mesopotamia is a place, and there were a number of cultures that lived in that area of the world prior to about 1200 BC. And so the Sumerians are kind of the first ones that show up. And then there's some other groups of people who move into that area and sort of take over a little bit later. Some Akkadians kind of from the north. This Babylonian culture shows up a little bit later, and Hittites show up even more recently. We said that Mesopotamia is kind of seen as the cradle of civilization because it's one of the first civilizations to appear on Earth. And so people start growing their own food there around 10 or 12,000 years ago. And again, by the time we get to about 7 or 6,000 years ago, we start to see a civilization. We start to see people living in cities, building large monuments, organizing themselves politically and economically, and inventing writing, the world's first writing. I took you through this really quickly just so we know what certain dates mean, how long ago things are. And this slide here is new from yesterday. I just wanted to say that this is some of the things that we want to focus on when we look at cultures throughout this course. And so we want to look at how cultures how they interact with and how they relate to their environment. We want to look at politics, so how a society is governed, who has power, and how that works. We want to look at how cultures interact and exchange things with other cultures. I have culture and environment twice there. That's embarrassing, but that's okay, I guess. Oops. We want to look at how cultures resolve conflicts, either within the culture or between cultures. We want to look at their values and beliefs, and we also want to look at their cultural expressions. And so most commonly, at least in the ancient world, that's art. Although people would have expressed themselves with dance and with music and with things like that. But again, often those things don't preserve, and we're kind of left with their physical art. So those are some of the things we'll try and pay attention to here. We said yesterday that Mesopotamia was the land between two rivers, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And so that's kind of this area of the world here in what's now Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Iran and Kuwait and Syria. Those areas are all part of this ancient area called Mesopotamia. We said it was the cradle of civilization. And so I asked you yesterday to read a few pages and answer these questions, which we did. And so I'll review these as I show you some other things, okay? Mesopotamia, some of you are kind of broadly from this area of the world, but Mesopotamia, for those of you who don't know, is kind of a semi-arid zone. And so it's a warm area of the world, but it's generally quite dry. And so the rivers became, as we discussed yesterday, the rivers are critically important to the people of Mesopotamia in order to have drinking water, but also to water their crops, right? We said that in terms of resources, they didn't really have much. They had a lot of mud, but some of the things that they needed to build their civilization, like stone and wood and metal, they didn't really have those things. And so they would have had to trade with neighboring cultures to get their hands on them. But yeah, the rivers were important for the Mesopotamians in order to get clean water, in order to water their crops. The rivers brought this rich kind of silt, and so when the rivers flooded, they left behind all sorts of organic material that helped fertilize their fields. And again, the Mesopotamians could use these rivers to contact other groups and trade with them, right? They could sail boats up the rivers and trade. We said that because the area was next to the rivers, but also very dry, that the Mesopotamians had to create irrigation technology. They had to build canals and ditches in order to properly water their crops. And as I kind of walked you through yesterday, the need to sort of coordinate and organize people and get them to cooperate in order to build these canals and irrigation ditches, the need to coordinate people can often result in the creation of sort of an administrative group and then ultimately of a state or a government. So here I included a couple pictures just so we could get a look at what this part of the world looks like. And so it's I'm not sure if this is the Tigris or the Euphrates. It's one of the two. It's quite beautiful actually though. But you can see how kind of dry the surrounding landscape is, and you can really see the areas that have been watered, right? You can see how green they are. but lots of the landscape is pretty kind of dry and brown. Yeah, here's another sort of modern picture of the area, and you can see some of the areas are kind of cultivated and they're growing. They've got some greenery there, but the hills are certainly very kind of dry and arid, right? Yeah, so we said the Mesopotamians have lots of mud, they have lots of agricultural produce from their farms, but they didn't have some of the other things they needed for their civilization. And so they would trade agricultural produce in order to get their hands on stone and wood and the precious metals they needed to survive. What we didn't talk about yesterday was that the Sumerians they arrived in the area. They arrived in the area probably around maybe 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, but we don't really know where they came from. Their language is not related to these Semitic languages that came later. And so the Sumerians are part of a different language group. Again, we're not really sure exactly where they come from and how they come to settle in that part of the world. But they do form a civilization there. And kind of at the height of Sumerian civilization, we're probably looking at around 1 million people living in that area of the world. And so that may not seem like a lot of people to us now, but for an area that has the first cities, that's a lot of people. This was a very kind of busy urban center thousands of years ago. And so some of these cities that spring up, we've heard their names written, Ur and Uruk and Lavash and Eridu. These are all early Sumerian city-states. Yep, we've talked about that. One of the questions we answered yesterday was, what were these cities kind of like? And we said that they were centers for organized religion, centers for government. They had social hierarchies. They had people who had more power than others. And they were kind of central places for trade, right? So they would have had markets with people trading all kinds of things that they needed to survive. And so all of these city-states had stone construction. All of them had a ziggurat in the center of the city, which was a home to the main god that protected the city. And around this sort of central ziggurat temple, there appear to be lots of other homes that were built as well. And the homes would have been built out of mud brick, maybe had reed roofs. And the city also had pretty extensive defensive walls. And so Uruk, for instance, had tens of thousands of people living within the city and had a wall encircling the outside. And so you can see in the photo here, this is kind of a computer-generated image. It certainly doesn't look like that anymore, but it gives you an idea of maybe what the city of Uruk might have looked like a few thousand years ago. And I think, I don't know what your opinion of this is, but I think that's really quite impressive, right? This is an impressive accomplishment for people thousands of years ago with really very simple tools and very simple technology, able to create, these extensive cities and buildings and roads. Unfortunately, many of these cities have not weathered well. If you remember, a lot of the cities are created with mud brick, and mud brick doesn't preserve quite as well as other things. And so modern day Mesopotamia, the ruins aren't quite as pristine as what they used to look like. They're actually, in many cases, they look pretty rough. Yesterday we talked about these ziggurats, which were the temple in the center of the city dedicated to the main god. And interestingly, they're not for public worship. And so regular people like you and me, we wouldn't go into the ziggurat to pray to the god, because the ziggurat was the home of the god. And so the only people who were allowed to go in were the priests, the temple priests, who sort of knew the correct things to do to honor the god. But regular people weren't allowed inside. So here's a much better preserved ziggurat. You can see some damage at the top, but you get a pretty good idea of what this type of architecture would have looked like. And you can see it's a really impressive structure, right? Lots of engineering knowledge would have been necessary to create something like this. Okay, so this morning I asked you to read a short couple of pages from the textbook and answer a few questions. And so that's kind of what I'd like to do now. So let's describe the Sumerian social structure. So what types of people, what kind of categories of people existed in Sumerian society? Who did we have? Who do we have in Sumerian society? Okay, so Cindy's got lots. So Cindy says there's upper class people, including kings and local rulers or local governors. She says there's priests, there's other government officials. In the middle class, we have artisans, so people who make art, basically. We have merchants, we have farmers, fishermen, and then in the lowest class, we have slaves. We have enslaved people. Mashid says the leaders would have controlled adjacent territories in at least a dozen city-states. That's true. So city-states, the rulers of city-states, they controlled their cities, but they also tried to control the areas around them. So that's true. We have kings, we have local rulers and priests and farmers and slaves. That's good. There's a level of people that are born to royalty. Yeah, we start to see that, Michael, we start to see that as well, in that we haven't talked about this yet, but we see status that is ascribed and not achieved. And so kings in many societies like this, they don't become kings because they deserve it or because they have won the kingship. They are the king because they're the son of the last king. The way you can think about this actually is there's two types of status. Maybe I'll make a slide on this for tomorrow. There's achieved status and ascribed status. And so status you achieve is something that you win or you earn. And status that is ascribed is status you get just by being who you are. And the example I was going to use of this is Black Panther. So hopefully you've all seen Black Panther. So Black Panther is T'Challa. He's the king of Wakanda, right? And so he's got two elements of status going on at the same time, right? He becomes the king of Wakanda because he's the son of his father, who was the king of Wakanda, right? That's an ascribed status, right? He becomes king of Wakanda because his father was king of Wakanda. But there was also that ritual where anyone could challenge him for the title of king. And so in the movie, he was challenged and he lost, right? And so the other guy, Eric Killmonger, he becomes the king of Wakanda, but that's an achieved status, right? He achieved that because he defeated T'Challa, right? He defeated the other king of Wakanda. So if you want to think about those two statuses, that's a good way to think about it. Ascribed status, T'Challa becomes king because his father was king. but Eric Killmonger becomes king through an achieved status. He defeats T'Challa and becomes king. Okay. Sorry, that was a bit of a detour, but that's okay. Let's see. So Lily had, I'll go back to Lily here. Yeah, so there are upper class people, the kings and the priests. There's middle class people who are people breeding animals and making products and farming and fishing, doctors and soldiers, scribes, people who knew how to read and write, because not everybody did. Actually, most people did not. And then in the very lowest class, we have slaves and farmers, right? And Tika has the same thing here, I think. And yeah, the social structure is very clearly stratified. And so stratified here means it has layers to it, right? Some people are on the top, some people are on the bottom. Yeah, and we had the ownership of slaves. So people and institutions could own slaves. Yeah, and the king is the authority here, right? The king is the head of the government system. Yeah, good stuff. Okay, next question. What is cuneiform, and why is it important? Yeah, what's cuneiform and why is it important? I know I typed what cuneiform, that's not very good. What's cuneiform and why is it so important? Okay, so Cindy says here, cuneiform is a written script of wedge-shaped marks, and it shows up around 3200 BCE, right? So that's before the Common Era. So if you think about it, that's about 5,200 years ago, people start to create this. Mashid says, yeah, cuneiform is a wedge-shaped written script, and it's important because it helps us learn about their civilization. Good, yeah. First type of handwriting? Definitely. Thika says cuneiform is a written script with wedge-shaped marks. It's important because it is present very early and helps store a lot of information and contributes to archaeology. Yeah, both of those are true, Thika. So it the writing has a lot of importance for the Sumerians, but it also has a lot of importance for archaeologists, right? And we'll talk about that in just a second. Casey says same thing. Yeah, so cuneiform is written in clay. The first written script in the world, yeah, it probably is, and if not, it's one of the first. And it's important because, yeah, we have a list of kings and scribes, who are people who knew how to read and write. They could write things down, like legends and poems, but also accounting and stuff, and tax paperwork. Type of writing used, yes, good. And it's important because it gives us a Sumerian kings list, that's good. It listed financial transactions, court proceedings, administrative decisions, and architectural plans. Yeah, so cuneiform, you're right, it's probably the world's first written script, or at least one of them. Do I have a picture? Yeah, let me see if I get a picture here. Yeah. So this is kind of what one of those tablets might have looked like. And it looks kind of messy to us, but this is how the Sumerians used to keep track of things. This is how they used to write things down. It's actually kind of fortunate that they developed this style of writing. And if you think about it, they didn't develop writing on paper because paper comes from trees, right? Trees are plants, but here in this area of the world, the Sumerians didn't really have a lot of trees. They didn't really have a lot of plants, but they did have a lot of mud, right? So they made these little clay tablets, and then they took a little piece of wood to write with, and you could make impressions in the clay. And so instead of writing on paper like we often do, they were writing in clay. But this turned out to be really useful. The Sumerians did it, of course, because that's the material that they had. But for archaeologists, it's been incredible because clay, when you fire it properly, is basically indestructible, right? Paper, we know, is very fragile. It dries out over time. If it gets wet, it just turns to mush. Paper doesn't preserve very well at all. But clay, again, preserves very well. And so we have huge libraries of Sumerian writing from the time. And again, it was very useful for the Sumerians because they could keep track of their taxes and accounting. They could keep track of their court decisions. And so it was a very useful tool for them. And later, they would write down stories and poems and things as well. But for us, it's been very useful because we have this huge library of things that people actually wrote down, right? And so we can not only tell what they did, but we can tell what they said, right? And we can tell what they thought and what they believed. And that's really important. That's an important function of writing for history and for archaeology, is because if you don't have things written down, you don't really know what people were thinking about, right? You have some idea of what they did, right? What behaviors they were engaging in, but you don't know what's going on up here unless people write it down, right? And so the Sumerians are kind of our first window in the archaeological record, not into what people are doing, but what people are actually thinking about. Okay, and so that's super important. Let me just go back here. I think I answered that question already. I have a bad habit of doing that. So we've kind of covered that. What were the Sumerians writing down? They were writing down tax paperwork and accounting. They were keeping track of administrative decisions and laws, but they were also writing creatively at some point too. And so they would start writing stories and poems and things like that. So writing was super useful for the Sumerians, but also super useful for archaeology as well. And so, believe it or not, not you and me, but historians can read this alphabet. They can understand what's going on here. Now, this is also important because it allows us to see what Sumerian language was like and how it worked. And that's important as well, because we said that one of the subfields of anthropology was linguistic anthropology. So anthropologists study how language is constructed and how it's used, and how people use language to pass culture on from generation to generation. And so I wanted to, just to sort of dip our toe in this, I wanted to talk briefly about this Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And so there's some criticism of this idea, but the idea was suggested that the way a language is built influences the way that people see the world. Okay? So those of you in the audience out there that speak more than one language, I think what you probably notice is that if you look at the two languages that you speak, or three, or four, if you look at the two languages you speak, I'm guessing that you'd probably notice that the two languages kind of divide up the world differently, okay? They categorize the world in different ways. And one of the ways that I think you sometimes see this is that if you want to translate something from one language to another, you can't just translate things word for word, right? You kind of have to think about the thing in the original language and then try to think about it in the language you're translating to. Sometimes things don't translate perfectly from one language to another. Do you notice that? Give me a yes or a no, or a thumbs up or a thumbs down. If you speak more than one language, do you find that sometimes you can't translate things exactly? You kind of have to translate the feeling of it or the impression of it because the words aren't quite the same. Do you notice that? Let's see. So Aliana, you notice it. Yeah, Chiffon notices it. Sam, yes. Yeah. Casey, yeah. Kinda. Okay. Dika, yeah. So yeah, it's really interesting, right? And so the world is kind of divided up differently depending on what language um, you speak. And so Jimmy says yes. Lim says yes. Mashid, yeah. So what Sapir and Worf were kind of arguing is that depending on the language you spoke, it would mean that you actually saw the world differently. You would interpret the world differently because the way that you understand the world, Carmen says yes, yeah. The way that you understand the world has entirely to do with language, right? If you're thinking about something in your head, you're usually thinking about it with language, right? You're usually kind of talking to yourself in your head, and you're talking to yourself using language, right? So the language you speak, Sapir and Worf are saying, the language you speak influences how you think about things and how you see the world. And so every language, every specific language that we speak, whether it's English or Mandarin or Cantonese or Vietnamese or Arabic or whatever, Swahili, French, Russian, whatever it is, whatever language you speak is a particular way of seeing and interpreting the world. Okay? And so, in one way, that's why anthropologists are so interested in studying languages, but also making sure that they're preserved, making sure that we don't lose languages, because sometimes languages go extinct, right? But every time a language goes extinct and nobody speaks it anymore, we kind of lose a little bit of human diversity, right? We lose a unique way of humans seeing the world. And so, again, it's really exciting when we have an ancient culture to study and we have their writing and we can actually understand it, because then we can really understand their world through their own eyes, right? We're not just looking at what's left behind and trying to figure out what they were doing. We can actually understand what they thought they were doing, right? How they understood their world to work. Okay. Yeah, so that's kind of what Sapir and Worf were talking about, is that language, the language you speak and the way your language is constructed influences the way you see the world in subtle ways, which I think is kind of interesting. So lots of what we have from Sumerian writing has to do with accounting and sort of administrative functions, but a lot of it has to do with religion as well. And so I want to talk a little bit about religion and I want to talk a little about story, but I think maybe it's a good time for a break, okay? So why don't we take 10 minutes and we'll come back after that and we'll talk a little bit about religion, okay? So take a break, stretch your legs, and I'll see you in see you in 10 minutes, okay? Okay, people, and we're back. So, we're just talking about cuneiform writing, right? And so the Sumerians create this written language or written script to capture their language. And it's very useful for them in terms of organizing their society, but it's also very useful for us in terms of learning what they were talking about, or learning the types of things that they thought and believed, right? Because ideas don't preserve, right? Ideas are invisible unless you write them down. And so, fortunately for history and archaeology, the Sumerians did write them down, and we have some idea of what kinds of things they believed. And so we do have a lot of writing from the Sumerians that talk about religious and supernatural concerns. And so we'll dig into religion as a aspect of culture probably next week when we talk about the Egyptians. I think we know more about Egyptian religion than we do about Sumerian religion. But the fact that this is the first written script ever in the history of humans means that this is our first opportunity to see what religion is like, right? Because societies and cultures that came before the Sumerians, so humans that lived 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago, probably had some sort of religious or spiritual or supernatural beliefs. But of course, when they don't write anything down, we don't really know, right? We don't know what they thought about death or life or the heavens or anything like that. We don't really know. So the Sumerians give us our first window into what humans were thinking about in terms of kind of the big questions that are not easily answered. And so the Mesopotamians are polytheistic, like we mentioned, so they have lots of different gods. We won't dig too deeply into them because there's a lot of gods, and it's actually pretty confusing in terms of how their family of gods operates, and so we won't dig into that. But the Mesopotamians felt they had a certain type of relationship with their gods, and so how they treated the gods were the gods demanded respect. The gods demanded offerings, and if they didn't get them, they would punish people. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting relationship with the gods here, is that the gods are kind of up there, they're big, they're scary, and if you don't pray to them, if you don't give them their offerings and sacrifices, then they're going to punish you, right? They're going to send floods, they're going to ruin your crop, it's going to be awful, right? And so that's kind of an interesting relationship with the gods, and for those of us from the sort of Judeo-Christian world, that's a different relationship, because currently the sort of the Christian God is a loving one, right? He doesn't punish you so much as is there to love you. But the Mesopotamian gods are not there to love you. They're there so that you can worship and honor them, and if you don't, there's going to be big trouble. So most of the gods are connected with some sort of natural force, and you see this in lots of polytheistic religions. And so the sort of natural world, the world around you is divided up and is under the control of certain gods. One of the interesting things about is this my next slide? Oh yeah. One of the interesting things about the Mesopotamian gods is that they are, in some ways, they're very human. They're of course all powerful, and they can control the universe and things like that, but they're not really identified as perfect beings. And so we see gods being kind of jealous and selfish, and sometimes they pout, and sometimes they cheat on their wives, and they do all kinds of sort of bad behavior that you might be used to seeing on a soap opera or something. And so the gods are very kind of dramatic in the way they behave, but they're also all powerful. And again, that's different from maybe a Christian sense of the world, and that's more what I know. But the Christian God is kind of this perfect being, right? This perfect being that is all loving, whereas the Mesopotamian gods are highly imperfect, right? They behave in all kinds of bad ways. Like I say, they're jealous, they're selfish, they try to seduce regular people, they cheat on their wives, they punish people. It's very dramatic, the Mesopotamian gods. Again, the Mesopotamians or the Sumerians tried to please the gods and sort of honor them and offer sacrifices to them to ensure that they weren't punished by the gods. Okay, and so the gods could punish them by sending floods or insects or bad weather to sort of ruin their crops. And so this is where the priests come in, right? And if you think about it, this is how the priests become powerful, because they have the knowledge to communicate with the gods, right? And if you don't want your crops to be ruined, if you don't want your family to be punished, you need the gods to like you, right? And who can help the gods to like you? Priests can, right? Priests have the sort of specialized knowledge in order to do that. And so that's what kind of allows priests to move up the social hierarchy. They're kind of up there a little bit below the kings, because they're the ones who can ensure that you get what you want, or to at least make sure that you're not punished by the gods. So priests can kind of use this spiritual knowledge in order to gain power in society, and they often do. One of the other interesting things is that the Mesopotamians have a really dark impression of what happens after you die. And so many religions have some sort of, if you don't believe in reincarnation, lots of religions have kind of a nice place that you go, right? Some sort of heaven or paradise, or some sort of place that you go that's nice, that's a reward after you die. But the Sumerians didn't have that. It seems that they believed in this kind of dark place that was in shadow that everybody went to after they died, whether they were good or bad. And so it's kind of a depressing view of the afterlife that the Sumerians had. But that's what they believed. Okay, so there's a couple big ideas in this course, and one of them is that we want to use our understanding of one culture to explain or to understand how other cultures work. Okay, so we want to be able to understand one culture and use that to understand how other ones work. And we also want to examine how belief systems and social organization and language and art are connected. And so in the text, I think you read a little bit about, or you heard a mention of the story of Gilgamesh. And so we'll talk about that tomorrow. Gilgamesh is a Sumerian or a Mesopotamian hero, okay? And there's a number of stories that are written about Gilgamesh. He has a number of adventures. He's the king of Uruk in the stories. And he's kind of a little bit like, he's kind of a little bit like, you could imagine him like Thor or Hercules. He's kind of, is he the one? So Michael, yeah, he is the king of Uruk in the stories. So he's kind of a Hercules, Thor type figure. He's a hero. He's the king of Uruk. He goes on a bunch of adventures. And spoiler alert, he will eventually die. But he's a hero in the way that many heroes in stories are. Okay. And so we have the story of Gilgamesh written down. So we know what the Sumerians were kind of thinking of when they read this story. And so I wanted to take a minute to think about the cultural importance of stories, because when we started out this class, I asked you, what kind of things do the Sumerians have that we have? And we said they have taxes, they have buildings, they have a centralized government, they have written laws, they have buildings, they have agriculture, they have religion. But one of the other things they have that we have is stories. And stories are something that are common to all cultures all around the world, presumably all the way back 300,000 years ago to the first humans. Telling stories is something that us humans have always done. And so it's probably a good idea to look at what stories are and understand how they work. And so to do that, I would like to have us speak to this guy. So a number of years ago, Jonathan Gottschall, he wrote this book called The Storytelling Animal: How Stories Make Us Human. And so when we started this course, we talked about anthropology, and anthropology wanted to understand, what does it mean to be a human? What are human beings? How can we describe them? How can we understand them? And in the book, what Jonathan Gottschall is saying is that really one of the things that is critically important to humans is the telling of stories. So it's not just that we walk on 2 feet. It's not just that we use tools. It's not just that we use language to speak. It's not just that we have big brains. All of those things are true, but Jonathan says that we tell stories and we create stories, and that's an important part of what it means to be a human being. And so I think this is an idea worth exploring a little bit. And so he's written this book. I won't ask you to read the book because that would be ridiculous. But he does have a video. He does have a TED Talk in which he describes kind of, I think, the main idea of the book. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to watch that video and then answer a few questions for me. Okay? So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to pop that into Microsoft Teams. And so I've got the link for the video in Microsoft Teams, and I have 4 questions. And so 3 of the questions will come from Jonathan Gottschall's TED Talk. And so I ask you, what kind of stories do we tell ourselves today? I will ask you, what happens to people's brains as they engage in story? This is really interesting. So whether somebody is reading a book or watching a movie or watching a television show, what happens when someone is engaging in a story in some way? Third question I'll ask you is, why do people tell themselves stories? What's the purpose of storytelling for humans? And then the fourth one is kind of a personal question, and I'll ask you, what kind of stories are your favorite? Okay? And why do you think you like them? Why do you think you like stories like this? Okay? So what I'm going to do, I can't show you the video through my live stream because that'll be copyright and I'll get my video taken down. So I have to let you kind of watch it on your own. So I posted the link and the questions in Microsoft Teams. And what I'll get you to do is I'll get you to watch the video, type out the answers to your questions, and then save them, and we'll address them first thing in class tomorrow, okay? Because by the time you watch the video and get your answers organized, we won't really have time to dig into it too much today. So for the rest of class, watch the video, type out some good answers to the questions, and we'll put them into the live stream first thing tomorrow. Okay? Is that cool? Any questions, comments, concerns, problems, statements? Or are we good? Let me know. Is that good? Is there a problem? Is there a question? Okay, so Ying's good. Sam's good. I wish the emoji for this showed up because it just says, you got this. Adalbert's cool. I know you're cool. Casey's cool. Aliana's good. Cindy's good. Okay. Everyone seems all right. Carmen's good. Dika's good. Okay. Karen's good. Michael's all good. All right, so go to Microsoft Teams. You will find the link for the video, and you'll find the questions I want you to answer. Type them out, and then first thing in class tomorrow, we'll talk about this Jonathan Gottschall talk and see what we can determine from it, okay? So Jimmy's good. Okay, so I'll let you watch the video. I'll sign off now, and of course, if you have any questions today or later, you can always send me a message. Okay, so thank you for participating in that live chat. That was really good. That was really good today. Watch the video, answer the questions, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Okay, so bye.